Hi, I'm Marilyn McClellan, commonly known as Mallies. I'm a linguist, not a medical person at all. As you can see, today is going to be talking about questions across cultures, and the subtitle I've given that is Navigating Our Way Cross-Culturally. Questions are some of the most difficult things in cultural navigation. Both cultures, Indigenous cultures and ours, have questions. In fact, I don't know a language in the world that doesn't have questions, formations. But the way we use questions are very, very different. How questions are formed is interesting, and we can learn how to form them appropriately to improve our communications with Indigenous people. This, I think, is of more importance, is not the mechanical works of questions, but the social or cultural way of using questions. The way we use questions in English is not the same as the way Indigenous people use questions in their languages. And it's a matter of good manners. So I've got a whole lot of facts that I've got written down, and they're just sort of, some are much more important than others. Go through. Number one, in Aboriginal society, it is not good manners to ask too many questions. You can ask the occasional one, but you just don't ask too many questions. In fact, I have seen this. Children are actively encouraged not to ask too many questions, or actively discouraged from asking question after question. Whereas we've got our 5-year-olds who might drive us mad asking everything and why, but they will discourage their kids from asking too many questions. We see it as a way of learning. They see another way is the way of learning, not that way. But I do want you to recognise that question after question after question. Yesterday I told you the story of Yuranjul coming in with a 40-degree temperature or 41-degree temperature and sick as a dog, and she was being asked a whole A4 sheet of questions before they would even look at her. And then when they did look at her, they asked it again because they'd handed her over to somebody else. And then when they said that they had to admit her, the nurse from the ward came down and asked her the same questions again, an A4 length. And I told you yesterday how she did not cope with that. She got to the middle of the second lot of questioning and said to me, "You do it," in language, so they didn't know that she'd told me. So, yeah, it's a big thing, and it's something for us to really grasp hold of. It's hard on them. It's very hard on them if you just keep asking question after question after question. Sometimes you might have to, and in which case, if it's law that you've got to, you actually have to say, look, I know this is really hard. Just relate to them. Remember, I was saying yesterday also that if you've got a 2-minute session and only 2 minutes, spend one of them in relating and you'll get better answers. Yeah, but anyway, I do know that you actually have to do it, and I do know that it's all part of the setup, but really they're adult people who don't like questioning, and so you need to do an explanation. You really do need to get them on side with you, which requires relating. Fact 2. Within their own culture, questioning is not usually a teaching technique. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen it as a teaching technique. It is in our society. You want to know that they've got what you've been teaching. You want to know that they've grasped it, and so you ask them to give you an answer from it. But it's not usually a teaching technique. Teaching is done by example and copying, by hands-on or by storying. If it's going to be done verbally, it will be done by telling stories and getting them to tell stories as well. And then they'll... So I would be collecting stories, be thinking of stories. You know, it's something that if you're working with Aboriginal people, develop storying to tell them through stories things. Could be things that you've already learned, could be things about how you didn't know something, how something happened, and they'll laugh uproariously at you, and then they'll help you along the way to learning what you should have done or what you should have said. Again, relationship comes in, and it's very hard when you've only got 2 minutes with them. Here's one, next fact. I don't know if this has ever happened to any of you, but it's very common. When you ask a question, you may be answered with silence. In our Balanda society, that means our non-Indigenous society, it is good manners to answer, even if it's an evasive one. If I ask you a question you don't want to give me the answer, you'll evade it in some way, but you'll sort of acknowledge that you heard a question. All right? And in fact, if you asked me a question, I just remained silent, you would feel snubbed, really. So it's very important that we, even if we don't give a direct answer, that we at least acknowledge we heard the question, and we'll give a sort of an evasive answer, or we might even say, oh, I can't answer that at this stage, or something like that. In contrast, there is no social obligation for a Yolngu to answer a question. So if you ask a question and they don't answer it, they're not being rude to you. They're not thinking that you're nasty. They're not doing anything. They're just exercising their right not to answer. If they don't answer, it's not meant as an insult. It's just that they have a reason to be silent. And it might be just that I don't feel like talking at the moment. I don't feel like answering questions at the moment. Can go from that right through to you have no right to know the answer to that question. And so they just have a reason to be silent. Now, the other thing is, when you ask a question, expect a long silence before you get an answer anyway. Have you ever been in meetings where there is a mix of Indigenous people with non-Indigenous, with Balanda, and a question goes out to the meeting, and really we can't, as Western people, we cannot cope with silence, and people jump in all the time. Every ward round. Yeah. Whereas if they just stood and waited, let the person collect their thoughts, and remember it's even worse. I mean, it's true even when Yolngu are talking to each other, they'll have a long pause before they contribute stuff. But when it's a Balanda with a Yolngu, remember they're trying to collect their thoughts. You've probably asked a question without giving them a suggested answer. They're trying to work out, now what is she wanting me to say? And they're busy, and then they've got to say it in English as well. So you just let them do it. Now, it's cultural for them to wait anyway. So if they're in a meeting, they're not going to just jump in like we do. That's our culture. I've got something to say here. I know the answer to that. I'll jump in. They're not going to do that. And so you'll have a mixed meeting, and I'm sure that some of you have been in on this, a mixed meeting, and the Yolngu have been present and have not said a thing the whole time. Because the Balanda are too, what's the word? What's a nice way of saying it? That's a nice way of saying it. Thank you. Yeah. So be careful and let it be long silences, like long silences. We can cope with about 5 seconds and then we have to jump in. Just sit back and think, no, I'm not answering that. I might know the answer, but I want my Yolngu colleague to answer that. And if you find that somebody else is jumping in all the time, you might jump in and say, let's ask so-and-so, so that you're giving that person then the time, you're giving the floor to that person, but then that person can just then gather their wits and give an answer. But it's very true, please, please don't jump in all the time because you're uncomfortable. That is a thing in questioning across cultures. Recognise that cross-culturally you do have to allow for silence. And it's not an ill-mannered silence, and they mightn't even be nervous. It's just manners, it's just how they work, it's how they think. We're very ready to blurt out something and then think about what we just said. And that's acceptable to us, but they're not. When they speak, it's thought through, and they speak. They don't blurt like we do. So please allow silence. Now, if you then start harassing for an answer, you'll either get two results. You'll get passive resistance, which means I'm never going to answer you. And they'll just sit there not answering, which isn't bad manners, but it makes us a bit flustered. Now what? So just be patient and wait for their answers. But the other side that you can get is that they'll give an answer that they think you want. And we talk about that maybe even in the next fact. This one is one of the biggest things of hurt across cultures. Yes. And it is one that you should circle and reread and take notes. Because it's still, I've been working with Yolngu since 1988, and I still, inside me, get offended at times and think, thankfully I don't show it, because I've learnt not to, but you thought, I feel like screaming when they ask me like that. But here's the difference. In English, if we ask a question, the responsibility is on the questioner. If I'm asking a question, then the responsibility is on me to assess whether it's a reasonable request before we ask it. Okay, so I don't know you very well at all, but blow me down. I've come here with Anne today in her car, and I need a car to dash up to somewhere at lunchtime. And Anne needs her car, and so I say to Emily, can I use your car? Now, I'll have had to assess that that was a reasonable request to ask. And it would mean that I hardly know Emily, so I would have to really need the car. It would be urgent that I needed it. I would have to assess that she didn't really need her car at the moment, and all of these things would be going through my mind, and I would be very apologetic as I ask. And so I would have actually filtered all of this, and it's my responsibility to have filtered all that before I ask the question. Now, when Emily hears me asking it, she works through the same filters. So she's thinking, oh, for Mally to ask me that question, she must really, really need that car. And I'm not using it at the moment, and she might feel very awkward to try to say no because I've obviously in bad need of that car. You see how the filtering is going on between the questioner and the person who's being questioned expects that the filter has has already been in play. Not so with Indigenous people. If you want anything, you just ask it. You don't filter it. The person who's receiving the question has to work out whether it's a reasonable request or not. And that is where the affront comes in, because we're expecting that it's a reasonable request. Like, how many times, any of you will have, who worked in communities will have had this. You're in town, you meet up with somebody you know really well who's in town, and they can't get home, they haven't got the money. So they say, can you buy my air ticket? And you think, I'm not overly rich, and it's a blinking lot of money to buy an air ticket to go out to Gullywinkle. And and you get sort of tight inside, and you're thinking, and then on top of it, you're not really supposed to say no as an answer. You give an excuse. We'll come across that in a moment. But you're feeling as though, how rude of them to ask for all of that money. And they're not. They're just out fishing, hunting, I call it. They're out there. Can you do it? Okay. If you give them some reason you can't, they'll move on to the next person. And I have learned that I can contribute. And I'll say, look, I can't give you all of that money, but I can give you $50. And they're happy with that. They might never spend it on an air ticket. It might be something else, and I don't care. But that $50, if they get $50 from another relative and $50 from another relative, they can make it all up into their 750. Into their 750. Yeah. Ridiculous prices. Yeah, so just remember when anyone asks you something that is extreme, they're not demanding it of you. They haven't put a filter through it like we do when we are asking questions. It's just that they're just asking you what's on their mind. Yeah, next one. The art of refusal. When you can't say no, what do you do for a no? White lies are considered acceptable. So you say, somebody comes up to you in Casuarina shops and says, you know, give me $20. And you say, oh, I've got no money, sorry. Then they watch you go into a shop and buy something. But they accept that as you saying, sorry, I'm not going to give it to you. But you don't actually say no to them. You see the way to do it? So sometimes our excuses can be valid, but they see it. Because that's the way you say no, they see it as a no. And you can't do anything about that. But that's what happens. Some people, when I say white lies are considered acceptable, some people go, oh, I'm not going to be telling lies to people. And then I think, well, we tell lies in our society, and we know that it's not straight. Like if you're feeling really crooked and I hardly know you, and I come in as a deliverer of this, and I say, oh, hello, how are you? That's part of the greeting. You're not going to say, oh, look, I've got this biggest pain in my ankle. And, you know, you don't go like that. You just say, I'm fine, thanks. So, and that's acceptable. And if later on I find out that you're really quite crook, I'm not going to say, oh, you told me a lie before.
Meaningless rituals.
Yeah, well, in a way, that's the same with them. When you're actually saying you've got no money, and you actually have got money, and they can even watch you go into a shop after that and buy something, then to them it's not, oh, she lied. It's, you had that excuse. You gave this excuse. You didn't use that word no, but you gave an excuse about not giving that money to them. There's some people have said, and I think it's quite valid, that Aboriginal people will vote with their feet. They won't, confrontation, and that part of this no, and it comes up in a later thing in here, confrontation is rude, is totally impolite. So they will not say no. They will not say a direct anything. that might be confrontational. So they'll just vote with their feet. They will leave, or they just won't turn up, even though you agreed with something, that something would happen. And then you need to recognise, oh, it might be that something else turned up, or it might be that they don't agree with what I'm doing. You can't assume that it's definitely that they don't agree with it. Let's move on. Fact 5 about questions. A lot of information is owned, so it's not our right to ask for it. This particularly comes in with cultural matters, and you can't just go, you actually have to earn the right to be told a lot of those things. And they will see your behaviour and see how your interactions, and they will share things. And very often they will share it when you haven't got the means of writing it down or taping it, or these days we've got phones, but in my day I remember my Aboriginal dad just suddenly out of the blue telling me all about did you know that the Clouds are owned by different clans? He didn't ask me that, but he was just assuming I knew that, and I didn't. And he was talking about the Wurundjeri clans and the Warramiri clans, and Clouds I mean, and I was such a learning experience. And I just walked up from the beach. I didn't have anything with me, not even a notepad or anything. And he just decided that this is the time. The Clouds were there. I was there. I'm learning about Wurundjeri, and I should know this detail. And of course I couldn't understand it. It was all not my culture, and I would love to have had it and had it recorded. And I still to this day haven't got it. He passed away in 2001, and I still grieve about that. But so sometimes they open up when you're not expecting them to, and give you a whole lot of knowledge that you're not expecting them to do. And they will not tell somebody else's story. That's a thing that's very important. A husband won't even tell the story of his wife. Like if she's sick, my sister's husband will come in and I'll say, isn't she coming today? And no, she stayed over there. And he will not say that she's sick, that she's got bad asthma or anything else, because that's her story and I've got to get it from her. So you've got to be aware of that as well. Now, with all of this, don't ask too many questions and everything. There are times when questions are relational, but they are very surface level questions. And teachers will recognise this in a classroom. I haven't seen it so much in adult classrooms, but the kids know perfectly well what book they're looking at, perfectly know what colour pen they're writing with or whatever else, but they'll be asking you, what book will I use? Where will I go? What's the pen? Where, they'll keep asking you, but they see that as relational. So you just keep telling them because they're relating to you. It's all very surface stuff that you know they already know. So that's just a little bit of a paradox, and you might find that that comes up as well, and you don't get annoyed with it, you just let it happen. This is an important one. Hypothetical questions are rarely found in Yolngu speech. For example, and Margaret Baines, and I've got her reference at the end, a government employee comes to the community to inquire how many new houses the community may need. The locals then expect that number of houses when they've been talking it through. And then after years, that number of houses hasn't come. And they just say white men are liars. And the white men, of course, were saying, if we can build these houses, if the finances are coming, they've got all these ifs in their mind, hypothetical situations, but these people have seen it as a reality. Interestingly, their word for if often is translated, the word that when we say an if, they will translate it as the word for when. And so you just think about this. if you don't get on the plane, then we can't pay for another one, which is very common when people are coming in for workshops and things. So it would be better if you say, when you don't get on the plane, we won't be sending another one. That's how their brain thinks of it. But their brain is not thinking of it as being, maybe you will get on the plane, maybe you won't get on. It's not that way. You actually have to state it that way. You actually have to say, maybe you won't get on the plane. When you don't get on the plane, then that's it. We can't send another one. Just a little funny one. Do you like parrotfish? If you actually, out of the blue, just say to someone, oh, do you like parrotfish? They'll think you've got some. And have you ever met anyone that didn't like parrotfish? One of the best eating fish you could have. And that's got big implications when we're doing things with people, because often we're talking in the hypothetical. And
you're talking about risk, you know.
Yeah.
It's hypothetical.
Yeah. And it's one of the reasons why they really find the whole concept of risk very hard to grasp. Alternative questions can be a problem. They aren't all the time, but it's just something that you can have in your head. If somebody misunderstands a question, you think, oh, well, I did do an alternative there. The word in Yolngu for or is war. In other words, they have borrowed that word from English. It was not there before. So if you're wanting to ask an alternative question, you're like, do you want to go to Casuarina Shops or to the water park? It's better to actually make two statements and then get them to make a choice. You say, there's Casuarina Shops and there's the water park. Where do you want to go? That's just a quick one. Often they're okay with them, but every now and then you'll find they stumble. And direct verbal confrontation is very bad manners, and we've already talked enough about that. No, so the other thing is, therefore, unless you know they know you very well, an Aboriginal person will give you the answer they think you want to hear, rather than what they really think, because they're not going to do any confrontation with you, and they're not going to say no to you. They're not going to have that confrontational thing with you, and so they might, at the best thing, stay silent. But particularly if you haven't been able to relate to them in any way, so they don't know you in any way, they are not going to give you an answer that they don't think you want to hear. So it's actually really quite silly for in a classroom of Yolngu people, and you say, do you understand? Of course they're going to say that they understand, because they don't want to offend you. And they don't want to have that confrontation of not understanding. To us, it's not like that. And in fact, I've learnt when I'm teaching adult Aboriginal people, the first time I'm teaching them, and then I reinforce it later, and I say, if you don't understand something, it is my fault. I'm the teacher. So I need to know if you don't know something. Please, please tell me. And when I do that, and then I reinforce that, going through with them, they get good at it. They get good at telling you that they don't know what you're saying. But you actually have to give them that space to do that. And if someone has been brave enough to actually ask something, you don't put them down in any way. You actually cheer. Hey, that person actually went right against their cultural expectations to actually tell you that they don't understand. And so that agreement with you, even when they don't really agree with you, which is a danger when it comes to medicines and all sorts of things, when you say, is that okay? Do you understand? Look, You've got to do this and this and this and this. Do you understand you? Yes, I understand. They're going to say that because they know that you would like them to understand rather than that they really understand. Isn't that tough? And you actually need to just do little side round things to see whether they really do follow. Like, do you know that this is what you've got to take tomorrow morning and the next day? And I said, oh, good. So what are you going to take tomorrow? And they can point to it. And then you'll know really whether they do, rather than it being something there. Now, there's a good, really fancy name for when they are agreeing with you because they think that they're giving you the answer that they think you want to know, and it's called gratuitous affirmation or gratuitous concurrence. So, in conclusion, how can I know if those I'm working with are understanding what I'm saying if I don't question them? And what can I do to get across the barrier? I think we've been answering that a little bit and getting some clues. And the more you work with people, like experiences, and that's how you get it. You build up experience and then you can share it as well. And you're always learning. You know, 88, I went out there the first time. I'm still learning a mighty lot all the time. And that's another thing to have in your mind, that you are never an expert. You're always learning in whatever you're doing. Okay, thank you.